Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our show. We haven't had a new video for you for a while, but I am glad at the beginning of what is the church year in September, we have as our first guest the renowned author, Orthodox priest, sociologist, and theologian, professor emeritus of the City University of New York, Baruch College, Father Michael Plekon. Father Michael, would you like to say hi to our viewers?
I really would. I first of all would like to thank you, Sister Vasa, for inviting me, and all of you people out there. I'm glad to be here. I always am thankful that you bothered to tune in, and hope to have something interesting to say today.
It is going to be interesting because we're discussing today, my friends out there, we're discussing with Father Michael his new book. He's the author of over a dozen books, actually, but this is the new book, indeed, Community as Church and Church as Community. Father Michael has authored books that I think we can say with scientific precision are classics, like Living Icons. This is an old one, but a good one. Has been interested and sharing with us his insights into holiness and urging us to notice holiness where we are not used to noticing holiness. For example, uh, in lay people, not monastics, the white clergy, as they're called, women. These are all demographics that one does not actually see well represented in our classic hagiography in the Orthodox tradition. So, Father Michael, I'm going to begin with my questions. First of all, why don't you tell us something about the title of your book? Is it meant to tell us something? There's an emphatic connection in this title, Community as Church, Church as Community. Was there a feeling on your part that maybe we don't connect church anymore with community?
Um, yes and no. First of all, if one goes back to the sources, and for us the sources always have to be the scriptures, we would go first back to the New Testament, wouldn't we? And when we go back to the New Testament, we have different words that over time we have come to associate with the church. Of course, there's the word ecclesia, which has behind it kahal in Hebrew, and ecclesia is the same in Latin and in Greek. It means a gathering. It means a coming together of people. It's interesting that for most people, at least English-speaking people, but I suspect in other countries too, where Kirche or Kirche or Église uh, are used, people immediately associate church with the building. Um, it's interesting that in the first years of the Christian movement, of the church as such, there was not a building set apart, but people's homes were where the church met or where people did church. Okay, uh, very communal. There's no way that you could be church or have church without a group of other fellow believers, sisters and brothers in the faith. However, I think, and particularly for people in the Eastern Church, and perhaps maybe even for the Slavic Orthodox, there's also this sense that I go to church for my spiritual needs. Father Schmemann spoke a lot about having to break through this kind of wall. That I go to church and really it's me and God. I don't necessarily sing with the choir because the choir does all of the singing, and the priest and the deacon and so forth are up there behind the royal doors and the curtains and the icon screen. And there's this unbelievable passage somewhere in the late Metropolitan Anthony Bloom's writings where he describes when he was still either a medical student or just a practicing young physician in Paris, that for years he stood next to uh, the man who would become the great theologian Vladimir Lossky, never spoke a word to him. They never had any interaction, of course, not during the services because they were focused on them, but even afterwards, because it was not the Russian custom to gather for tea or cakes or coffee or whatever. Um, My experience of church growing up, first in the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church, and then in the Latin Roman Catholic Church, and then all the other churches I've been associated with, including the OCA, the Orthodox Church, here in America, is really quite different. I wonder what your experience in Nyack was. It was an intense sense of community. I mean, people, when they came to church, would greet one another. There would be sotto voce, quiet little conversations, even during the services. And I mean, if one calls it the liturgy after the liturgy in a joking way, because it's a serious way of talking about that, or even saying it's the ninth sacrament, depending on how you count, or the eighth sacrament, or whatever, the coffee hour is a standard part of church in America. I remember we had some Russian immigrants who came to my old parish up in Dutchess County in the Hudson Valley, and who came to me after church in the coffee hour. Here I am in my cassock and my cross, and they say, Ochi, this isn't really an Orthodox church, is it? This is a Baptist church. And I say, how did you figure that out? I mean, there are icons upstairs, right? Candles, lots of incense, vestments. Oh, yeah, but we never do this back home. We never have this kind of, celebration, almost like a feast after the liturgy. And the priests never talk to us like you're talking to us. And I said, I can assure you, despite the fact that it's in English, and even though there are icons, candles, incense galore, vestments, cassocks, crosses, beards, even, this is an Orthodox church. Wouldn't be bad if it were a Baptist church either, but no.
Right.
So to answer the question finally, I mean, really, community is at the heart of the church. And one of the first things I knew that some people would object to is that they would say, well, when I hear community, in fact, once on a Zoom talk, this even came up from a rather angry deacon in the UK. He said, when I hear community, I get itchy, almost allergic, because I think of happy talk, and I think of clinking cups, and I think of people, chatting and gossiping, and I don't consider that to be church. Poor man, poor man. What I had in mind is koinonia, which is the way that in the Acts of the Apostles in particular, but also in the letters, the epistles, church is described. As I said before, church is not just ever really described as a building. If there's a place of worship that is described in the New Testament, either it's the temple in Jerusalem, or it's the synagogue in Nazareth, or the synagogue in Capernaum, or somewhere else. When church is mentioned, it's the people who are wandering around Palestine in the first century. That's the church. They're the women who are financing it and who are part of it, and the brothers who are following this wandering rabbi, Jesus. And that is the first church. And then eventually that church will find a home, that it will move, as Eugene Peterson says in his translation, it will pitch its tent. No, Peterson says it will move into the neighborhood of Andronikos and Unia's house, or Phoebe's house, or Priscilla and I can't remember her
Aquila.
husband, Aquila's house. And Paul will greet the holy ones who gather and meet as church in the houses of these married couples or women who he calls his own co-workers, his own co-ministers. So community is not some kind of humanistic or sociological, as I was accused of making it out to be, substitute for church. It's not a watering down or a leveling out. It's at the very heart of church. And in the book, as you probably know, as a theologian, I grounded this at the start in the work of a number of theologians, but most especially Nicholas Afanasieff, his famous book, The Church of the Holy Spirit. He was important. He was not the only one, but he was very important in reintroducing the idea of the church as the place where the Eucharist is celebrated, where people gather for the Eucharist. So people refer to Afanasieff as having recovered a Eucharistic ecclesiology. So then we have somebody saying, well, he's reducing the church to the Eucharist. No, no. If you read Afanasiev's writings, the book that I'm talking about, which is his major work, and then all the other things that are in print one place or another. Victor Alexandrov in Hungary has published a wonderful little anthology in Russian of the original text of Afanasiev, even part of what would be the second volume, companion to the Church of the Holy Spirit. Well, it becomes very, very clear the first step into the community, the initiation, as we call it, is baptism. And Afanasiev is a strong proponent of the priesthood of all the believers, that they're priests and deacon and prophets and kings or queens of the kingdom. I mean, that is central. That takes nothing away from the ordained. But then, I mean, what Afanasiev says is those who are ordained, that is, who have hands laid on them for service, for ministry to the rest of the community, and who are responsible to them, have to come out of that community. In the first several centuries, it was unthinkable that somebody from hundreds of miles away would be called in to become your bishop or your presbyter, your priest, or your deacon. I mean, the obvious choice, given the geography and given the technology of travel in those days, is that it would always come from within the community. And there are still examples of that today. Community, my argument in the book is, and I'm only repeating what Afanasiev and Father Schmemann and Father Bulgakov, and then all of the Western return to the sources thinkers like de Lubac and Skilbeck and the others, is that the church is best understood as the community that gathers around the scriptures, that breaks the bread and shares the cup, that is together in the prayers and in the teaching, and then in the works of love. And that, by the way, is a paraphrase of how the church is described at least two times in the Acts of the Apostles in the first 10 chapters. I think first in chapter 3, and then later on in another chapter. When the church is described, it's the people who gather, you know.
Right. Um, Father Michael, I want to get a little bit more to the specific, I would call it problem that you're addressing about
Mhm.
parish demise, the demise of traditional parish life and church attendance, specifically in the United States, not just in the Orthodox Church, but across the board in
Right.
various Christian denominations. So you're addressing how it is that one can see through the phenomenon of
Mhm.
what we might perceive as the death of the parish.
Yep.
Everybody, don't be shocked because Father Michael is seeing this in light of the resurrection and how the old forms, in certain ways, to the extent that they are in decline for various reasons, and he takes that apart. I would suggest and recommend for to anybody interested to read the book rather than just hear what I say about it or how, in the brief time that Father Michael has that he says about it. Anyway, you're talking about how this can point to resurrection and lead to resurrection in different ways. And I especially appreciated your eloquent, reference to the empty tomb and how
Mhm.
when we are told he is not here, when we're seeking the living among the dead, so to say,
Yep.
uh, I'd like for you to share those thoughts about how can one see if one's parish is indeed in decline. Perhaps there are people out there that don't have a parish in decline,
Yep.
but a lot of people do, right? The numbers aren't what they used to be and so forth. So how would you help us to see how we can compare a declining parish to an empty tomb, the empty tomb of Christ?
Okay. Before I get to that, I do have to backtrack, and I hope you don't mind this,
No,
to
not at
say
all.
something about why the decline and what is the decline.
Right. Okay.
The decline is universal. It is to be found across the world It is to be found in every church body, every denomination or Christian community that there is. There, of course, are exceptions, and usually for purposes of propaganda, uh, organized church bodies will provide us pictures of thousands of people at a liturgy, let's say in the Christ the Savior Church in Moscow, or in some other place, some other cathedral in the West. Well, the reality of it is that if you go across most of Europe, you can't get above 3 to 5% of people coming to church on a regular basis. It varies from country to country. It goes up and it goes down a little bit. By comparison, the United States, at least, not Canada, leave them out of it for the moment, but the United States is like a religious circus in the sense of there are a lot of people still going to church. I have to admit, I am by trade a sociologist of religion, not a quantitative number crunching sociologist. But my teacher was Peter Berger, the very famous theologian and sociologist of religion. But I do have a chapter in the book in which yeah, that's the man, and I'm mentioned in that book too. But I do have a chapter in the book in which I say, folks, if you don't like numbers, you're not going to like the next 10 or 15 pages. But the numbers cannot be ignored. You can't talk about church without at least understanding something of what it looks like on the ground as it's really happening. If you want to talk about it in theory only, fine. But then that is almost heretical because the church is nothing if it's not people. It's the people of God. So, why is there decline and how long has there been decline? Mark Chavez is the dean, I think, of American Sociologists of Religion. He's been at this for 30 years. He says that at the very least, you can go back at least a century and see decline. But then he nods toward historians like Rodney Stark and others who point out that if you look at figures for church attendance, I mean, actual people in a building somewhere or in a house somewhere, even back in the 1700s, what you find, lo and behold, is that there is no golden age where the churches are crammed with souls. There are periods of time where there is great unrest, for example, during the Civil War in the 19th century and during the First World War, during the Great Depression, during the Second World War, and right after the Second World War, where church attendance boomed. And in fact, many people, depending on their age, will remember their youth. I don't know about you, but lots of people in church. I mean, vaguely, that's what I remember. But when I went back and looked at the actual numbers, I realized that maybe I just was in a parish, a very big parish, where even a small percentage of people going would make the place look like it was packed. I mean, my parish that I spent most of my time in had I don't know how many liturgies on Sunday morning. This is the Catholic parish. The Ukrainian one had just one, but the Roman Catholic one had 5, 6 spread out throughout the day. At any rate, the biggest single factor for a decline in parishes has nothing to do with doctrine, has nothing to do with belief, but it has a lot to do with where people live throughout their lives. It's a demographic factor. Um, those of us who remember growing up in parishes will recall that there were multi-generational families. So you could say grandparents, their children, and then their children, so the grandchildren. And in some cases, if they lived long enough, we're blessed to do that, maybe even great-grandchildren. I remember this from parishes not only that I grew up in, but since I've been ordained about 40 years, some of the parishes that I served in, right? However, in the time since the Second World War, most people in America have experienced mobility in a way that previous generations had no experience of whatsoever. Mobility here means not just that you could get in a car or a bus or a train or a plane and go somewhere. Yes, that's mobility. But I mean mobility in terms of where you live, where you work, where you raise a family, where you go to church. There has been enormous mobility since the 1950s on down to the present time. And the best way to illustrate this is that there used to be hanging in the narthex of my parish up in Wappingers Falls, St. Gregory Orthodox Church, a rather large version of a photo that was taken on St. Gregory the Theologian's feast day back when I first came there. Now, not everybody in the parish was in the photograph, but everybody who came to church that day was scrunched and squeezed into the. You've seen parish photographs like this. And what's amazing about it is not that there were, you know, the two priests, myself and Father Alex, and two bishops there, Bishop Seraphim Tigris, retired, and then Archbishop Peter Louvillier. But there were about, I think, altogether, if you counted everybody in the picture, there were probably about 130, 140 people, of whom, hold on to your seats, 72 were children or young people. 72 out of 140, almost 50%, or about 50%.
Right.
That picture was taken in 1996. Do the math. It's now 2021. Of those 72 young people, children, high school students, there are maybe at best 7 still living around the church, within an hour of the church,
Right.
none of whom themselves come to church, but in most cases, their parents, that is to say, grandma and grandpa, bring their kids to church. If I had to point to one single influential factor in the decline of parishes, that is it. People moving, uh, people going to another town, another city. Then you might say to me, Father Michael or Professor Plekon, well, why don't they go to church in the other city? Oh, lots of reasons. That's when we get into secondary variables, like they marry out of the church that they were in, out of the ethnic group that they were in. They can't decide on which church to go to. Or in time, they just are so busy that they decide Sunday morning is one of the few times that we can just relax. Or maybe we go camping on the weekend, or go to the lake or the mountains on the weekend. Or, and I'm summarizing a lot of other variables here, we get sick and tired of a church that looks down on LGBTQ people, doesn't consider them to be children of God, looks down on women, has nothing to say about the world and the life that we're living. It's only focused on prayers, only focused on heaven, only focused on what goes on in the liturgy. I mean, that's when we get into things that then people can get, I think, incited about. I've had people get very angry when they hear from me that studies report that people stop going to church because they're tired of listening to what they hear in church, which seems to them contrary to Jesus and contrary to the good news that Jesus preached. So I just want to make sure that you understand and that everybody's watching understands. It isn't primarily about doctrinal disputes that people have turned into religious nuns, not like what you are, NONES, meaning that when asked, do you have any membership in or connection to, do you go to a church or synagogue, do you support it with financial contributions, do you go pray there? Their answer is no, and so therefore they are religious nuns. And then a subcategory of them are religious duns, DONES. Yes, I used to. Yes, I was raised in that. Not so much anymore. All right. So the picture of decline is not something that's deniable. Many church officials, administrators, will try to say, "Oh no, even if our people don't come to church, they're still praying at home. They still believe." And actually, you might be surprised to hear from me that they're not wrong in saying that. Surveys of religiosity among American people show that despite the fact that we're down to, let's say, only half of Americans going to church on a regular basis, which is staggeringly high compared to the rest of the world, over 70% of people say that they have a spiritual life, that they believe in God or some kind of power, that they meditate, that they pray, that they have some sort of code of ethics by which they live, and that they believe that they're here on the planet to do good, not to just enrich themselves. That's a wonderful thing to hear, even in a troubled time like ours, where people are at each other politically. Um, Again, surveys or at least numbers like that, you can use them for various purposes, but the numbers don't lie. There is a spirituality, and I would have to say, having been a university professor, the majority of my students over 40 years did not regularly attend church, no matter what background they came from, whether they were Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, or whatever. They were non-practicing. Were they people of faith? Were they people of spirit? Oh, indeed they were. The people I taught at City University were largely, if not immigrants themselves, they were the children of immigrants or the grandchildren of immigrants, and they were usually the first in their family to be at university.
All right. Well, thank you for all of these insights, Father Michael, and your knowledge of these issues. I want to, zero in on this question of how you see it in the light of the resurrection, how when there is the empty tomb, and when we think that that's a sign of something negative or that he is dead,
Yeah,
and how you're saying, no, we have to hear, you're seeking the living among the dead. And then I'll get to other questions that I think, well,
thank
to
you.
my mind, arise from what
Thank you.
somebody might think it is maybe an unreasonable kind of optimism on your part, but I'd like to hear how you see this as a sign perhaps of resurrection.
Well, thank you. You remind me of both the two women who are very important in my life still, and that would be my spouse Jeannie and my daughter Hannah, because they usually say, "Can you get back to the point? Can you answer the question?" Which is the one you asked. And I
No,
said I
I
would.
mean, like anybody who knows a lot about something, and
Yeah,
people ask very simple questions, and you say, "Wait a minute, back up. Let me
yeah, yeah.
go back
Well,
to the beginning." So I
you,
totally understand that. I often
yeah.
get told also that I'm not answering the question, but I'm like, "Wait a minute, but I have to modify your question because
Well,
it's misleading." Yeah.
both of us are educators, and I think that's not an excuse or an alibi, but I think you do have to explain things. Death and
No,
resurrection.
that's
Well,
why
yeah,
you're here. That's why we invited you. So
sure.
explain away. Explain away.
Not not for my looks. Um, anyway,
Well,
uh,
those two, but I didn't know if I was allowed to say that about a
you're my good friend. Yeah. So anyway, where does death and resurrection come into all this? Where's the empty tomb? We might say. So, after I gave the bad news, so to speak, and I should say that, one editor of a church publication originally was not going to publish a 2,000-word version of this book because the first 2 pages so depressed him that he said, "I can't possibly take this." And I said, "Why don't you read further?" Um, what's at the heart of our faith? Everybody who knows Christ, everybody who tries to follow Christ, somehow has in their vision the death of Jesus on the cross and the resurrection, is being raised to life. He talked about that as he went around Palestine healing and preaching and teaching. He mentioned it every night when he broke bread with his followers. That's at the core of our faith. Pascha or Easter is the feast of feasts. There's no feast that comes close to it. It is our Passover or our exodus from life to life, right? It's everything to us. That's when someone who's not a Christian asks, why do we get so excited about a service in which we share bread and wine, you kind of have to explain that to them. Behind it lies the reality of death and resurrection. We see death around us all the time. Look at Afghanistan and what unfolded in the last 2 weeks. Look at the almost 30 people who died in the New York City region because of the remnants of the Hurricane Ida. Good friend of mine, Tresha Denisenko, died unexpectedly at the age of 48. Death is a reality. Death waits for all of us. But the question is, what does it mean? And Christ has given us the answer. It means not the end of anything, but the continuation and a new life in God. By the way, there are plenty of other people of faith who believe that, not in exactly those terms. When you look at the decline of parishes, um, you see in it what appears to be nothing but death. Those of us who know history know a little bit better. We know that there have been lots of patterns of decline in the past. We also know that when we talk about a congregation or a parish, we're talking about a set of structures that have been around for well over 1,000 years, but it's not the way it was in the beginning. And it may be after we're gone, but it will be around and yet not necessarily in the same form in the future. And that is something that I try to talk about in the book later on. But the empty tomb means that even when there's decline, we have to see the power of the gospel, the power of Christ present there. So if in fact, rather than 150 people on a Sunday morning, there may be only 30, that's significant. But it is also significant that there's 30 people there. I mean, just as under times of persecution, people had to hide worshiping together, close the curtains and the window shades in order not to be detected by the police. Maybe do it under the blankets in prison camps and stuff like gulags. The resurrection cannot be snuffed out. And what I tried to do, and this is why it took so long for the book to come out, is to collect examples. I mean, actual examples, not theories, not recipes by church consultants, but examples of congregations who had experienced not decline to death, but resurrection. And these are examples that make up the bulk of the middle of the book, probably the bulk of the book.
So
They
give us
are.
some examples, Father
Yeah,
Michael.
I'm going to. These are churches of all different kinds, not just Orthodox ones, but Catholic, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Anglican, and others. I'll take just one for an example. I'll give you an Orthodox example. In Kansas City, Missouri, on Troost Avenue, there is an old commercial building that some 40 or more years ago, a guy named Ray Altschul bought with his wife in order to set up some kind of a community center. In time, this guy became Father Alexei Altschul. He entered the Orthodox Church, prepared for ordination, was ordained in the Serbian Archdiocese. I can't remember what her Orthodox name was, but he was married to an Afro-American woman named Thelma. That will be important in a moment. And the two of them used to feed people out of the back door of their house. Anybody who was hungry, who knew about them, could come and they would give them whatever they had. She would always make 2 or 3 times more than what they needed for a dinner. And she would have canned goods. It was like a food bank, a personal food bank. But in this center, it was not enough for him to start, going out to the Kansas City social services agencies, to the mental health agencies and say, we have space, help us renovate the space and you can have it, we'll pay the rent. And of course, what did he do? Upstairs, just like with Mother Maria Skoptsova, he put a church up there and it became the parish of Saint Mary of Egypt, but he had in mind also Mother Maria Skoptsova because she took as her religious name, her monastic name, the name of Mary of Egypt. And I'm assuming that people know a little bit about Mother Maria. Her ministry, once she got it going, was to open up houses of hospitality. First, it was for elderly people who had no place to live, and they simply became houses of hospitality, same way that the Catholic Worker and Dorothy Day did it, for anybody who needed a roof, anybody who needed a meal, anybody who needed some kindness and an ear to listen, and medical services and so on.
Right, but about this church in Kansas City, so uh, we're not talking about something that began with the decline of
No,
Parish. This was
no,
simply a different way of, well, connecting church life and
yep,
liturgical life, right? There was a church
that's exactly
worship
right.
space with
That's it.
helping the neighborhood, right? The
That's
poor
it.
and needy. But I want to see how, I want you to tell us how, I have read your book. I know that you offer answers in the book about a concrete example of decline, and then there being a transformation of some sort, a little
Yep.
bit of a repurposing, you
All
know?
right. So I gave you this Orthodox example because it has within it. I mean, you could say it started out in decline because there were only 10 people.
Right,
And even
right,
the bishop said, I don't really, well, he said, you don't even have any Serbs there. Duh. How can you possibly have a parish?
right.
Um, so it started off in decline, but it grew not only because people gathered around the Eucharist and prayer and the scriptures, but also because downstairs there was something that from Monday through Saturday gave the church a presence, gave the church a purpose. So, resurrection, I propose in the book, can also be translated as replanting in a community, repurposing space in buildings or repurposing property, redefining or reinventing your relationship, not as church, but your relationship to the neighborhood around you. Now, those are not recipes. See, I don't like recipes. I like recipes for cooking. I love
Right.
I don't like recipes for how to do it in church. And most people want a recipe. And I say to them, there is a recipe, but you have to find it in your community and in your neighborhood. So, St. Mary of Egypt in Kansas City still exists. Sadly, under another pastor, the parish has kind of retreated. They bought an abandoned church building, they moved out of the upstairs, they're renovating the whole building. But the ministry of what's called reconciliation services continues with a good friend and former intern of mine, Father Justin Matthews, as the director. And this is his appointment from his bishop to, during the week, if you will, be the priest in charge, not of a parish, but of a diaconal center. I mean, I'm calling it that. They don't call it that. Of a place in which there are counseling services, clinics for the elderly, clinics for mothers, and a wonderful pay what you can restaurant called Thelma's Kitchen in
Yeah, I love
honor
that.
Kira or the Matushka. And there's a beautiful iconic fresco of her on the big wall there. And the culinary school, the Culinary Institute in Kansas City, actually has their students go there to train, and their professors take turns being chefs at Thelma's Kitchen. Let me give you another example. After a long career in church administration in Chicago at the headquarters of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America that I used to serve in as a presbyter,
Yes.
um, a guy in the last 5 years of his ministry, because he was close to retirement, came out of administrative work and was asked for a parish, and they gave him a parish, a Redeemer Church in North Minneapolis. He gets there, and there's this beautiful Gothic nave and tower with the bells in it, and an educational wing, and a rectory, right? And attached to all of these, a whole string of commercial buildings on the first floor and apartments on the second floor, uh, and 12 people on a Sunday morning. So this guy says to the folks, uh, we can stay here, but we have to become church in a different way. He didn't undo the Sunday liturgy. They kept celebrating every Sunday, breaking the bread, sharing the cup, hearing the word. But what they did do, the first thing they did is they took out a loan, partially from the National Church, partially from one of the banks, and bought up the string of buildings that was actually attached to where the rectory was, because this was a street in Minneapolis. Got a coalition in the community together, renovated the commercial spaces, offered them at below level rents to small businesses, then renovated the spaces above for senior housing,
Right.
took their unused parking space and turned it into a park where food trucks every Sunday afternoon after church, food trucks would come. There were picnic tables and plenty of shade, and you could spend a bit of Sunday afternoon with some really good food and people from church and people from the neighborhood. Well, when you lay it out that way, you say to yourself, I don't see the empty tomb. Well, I do. The church was almost empty. A big, beautiful church with no future because nobody from the neighborhood was going to it. Did he fill the church? I mean, did he bring 500 people in to fill that nave? No. He got up to around 100 or 120 or something like that. He's now retired and somebody else has come in to be the pastor. But he had some sense for church as a community and church uh, reaching out to the neighborhood around it
Right.
in various ways.
It seems,
Yeah.
Father Michael, if I can chime in here, that uh, when you say that he did it, he
No,
did
he
do this,
he
or
didn't
he
do
didn't.
it.
Right, right.
He didn't
Uh,
do it.
the
The community did it. Yeah.
Right, and it's not to take away, from his pastoral role,
Yeah.
but I find it interesting that what I'm hearing, what you're sharing with us, and also from your book, the common denominator of the examples of resurrection or new forms of life in any extent, in any event, it
Yep.
seems to be people. The common denominator is people getting together
Hmm.
in faith, in this case, in Christ,
Hmm.
Christians, and taking an initiative also to do together, to
Yep.
do together what it is according to their vocations they can do in the specific context of their space and their time and their talents and their shortcomings, and that
Right.
this is not hindered by the straitjacket of there's only one way to do this,
Exactly.
that this could
Exactly.
be. But my question would be that that liturgy and worship and the celebration of sacraments in something that we call a church parish, it doesn't seem to be something that one can do without. It's a sine qua non. I
Right.
just can't think outside of that framework, that we
Right.
need the
Right.
sacrament celebrated. But
Yeah.
in the Byzantine rite, of course, I realize that you're talking about different Christian denominations, but the church to which I belong, though, that we both belong to, I think there's a very specific definition of what that looks like.
But Sister Vasa, it's not it. I don't know quite where you're going with this, but
No,
I
I'm
hope
just
it's
saying we need to have liturgy and the celebration of sacraments.
well. All Christians have worship. They may not call it the divine liturgy,
No,
right?
I know. I'm just saying, I'm speaking of
Yeah.
what I know. So in that, because I think a lot of our viewers, not all of them, are Orthodox Christians,
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
I'm narrowing down the question of, okay, how about, to what extent can this very specific animal that is Byzantine liturgy, because it requires a lot of, it's hard to keep a Byzantine Rite liturgy if you're doing it correctly. I mean, there are issues here. Like, my question really is, if I could phrase it very broadly, to what extent can liturgy both foster and or hinder the possibilities of resurrection? I mean, I'm being very provocative here, and I don't want
Well,
to insult anybody, but there are difficulties with keeping up. I've seen it happen in parishes, where the priest, let's say, and the choir, and it's almost like they're trying to resuscitate a dead corpse because they want to
yeah,
have 3-hour vigils, and they're thinking we should increase services, not decrease them. Nobody's coming to vespers or matins, and they rarely come to divine liturgy. Anyway, these difficult questions, we might not have a full choir. Our the Russian tradition, the Ukrainian one requires,
yeah,
all of this. It's challenging to have a choir that sounds decent. Anyway, so my question again, I'll repeat it.
yeah.
To what extent does liturgy, not only divine liturgy, right, in the Western sense, either hinder or foster the kind of resurrection that you're talking about?
We know that liturgy is both divine and human. It is of the spirit, but by definition, it is material, spatial, and temporal, right? Otherwise, we couldn't celebrate it, right? Otherwise, we would, like Quakers, simply sit in silence, or the Buddhists sit in meditation, and that is beautiful, and that is also part of the Christian tradition too. But we're talking about liturgy. I mean, the root of the word means the work of people, right? At least that's the translation that I prefer. Public work is actually the better translation, right? So to put up a bathhouse in the ancient world was liturgy. That contains, I think, the kernel. Liturgy cannot be just for itself. One of the people that I cite at the end of the book is a now dead Episcopal priest in this country who, for many years, led the Alban Institute, Lauren Mead, Father Lauren Mead. He used to say over and over again, because he spent many years in the parish before he began to do the work of the Institute, which was to assist parishes better understand their neighborhoods, to better understand their outreach, to better understand their teaching, preaching, and so forth. He started this back in the 60s, so he did it for a good 35 years until his retirement, and he died just a few years ago. But what he said is that the church has never and can never live just for itself. And if you stop and think of other uh, voices that we look up to and appreciate, uh, good old Father Robert Taft right behind you on the shelf, and Father Schmemann up there on the shelf also, and Father Afanasieff and so many others, they would echo that. They would agree with that, because the very nature of the liturgy is we give you what is your own, we receive this from you, and it is for the life of the world, to echo the title that was given to Father Schmemann's very famous book. It was originally called something else, Sacraments and Orthodoxy, but somebody had the bright idea to use the line from St. John's Gospel, for the life of the world. It
Right.
was the bread for the life of the world. That's what we're supposed to receive, as St. Augustine says, and then become what we receive, which is we become bread for the life of the world. That's the kernel. So liturgy is never divorced from actual life. It is never divorced from the world. But you and I know that there has been a trend throughout the history of Christianity to turn liturgy in upon itself. Do as many services and lengthy services, particularly in the Eastern Church, but also Cluny. All right. Let's not forget the West. They had their version of this too, right? As many services as possible, because that was seen as the very raison d'etre. The reason for being of the church is to do these services.
it's a very practical problem, I think, that so many parish priests come up against now, aside even from the challenges of doing Byzantine Rite services. Again, I'm simply referring to what is most familiar to me. In the circumstances of the pandemic and live streaming and all of this, that turns it even more so than it usually is, a performance of
Mhm.
the, what we call in the Russian, обслуживающий персонал, the
Mhm.
personnel. you know
Yes.
so what the priest is often challenged with is that there need to be services, but at the same time, they are often so uh, inaccessible to people, both because of their length, because of their very Byzantinized way of worshiping, the bells and
Mhm.
smells, the clothing, uh, a lot of these forms and their symbolic language.
Mhm.
It's a separate catechetical problem, but
Mhm.
uh, in a way that certainly is not intended by the church, it might be alienating a lot of people and really making them feel like they don't really have much that can
Mhm.
nourish their faith in what's going on there. And so we
Mhm.
end up in many parishes, at least, again, I don't want to offend anybody. I am talking about something that is my life. I never had a life outside of this whole weird thing that we have, which
Mhm.
is present day Orthodox church tradition and the way these things work. I am usually the one that is very much involved in the whole typicon and the intricacies of the services. However, I feel how much this has become a mixed blessing for us. And, you know, I certainly try to do from my little bell tower that which I see is possible. But, I have a monstrosity of a divine liturgy course. It's in its 46th lecture and I'm only up to the epiclesis, and I think I have to roll up my sleeves and explain to people, because the problem is that they don't understand it. If they understand it, it won't be this alienating thing. But what you're talking about is that those other para-liturgical, sticking to a strict sense of the celebration of, let's say, the actual services, worship services, I think you're calling us to see that there are liturgical ministries that we're called more to integrate into that
Mhm.
aspect of our liturgical life. And so
Yeah.
I'm trying to, I think with you and to, glean from what you're offering us here. How can we not turn the liturgy into something that is hurting the parish? Because people who don't show up to the services, and I've observed this, that in the actual church service, aside from people that might be, mowing the lawn, cooking the meal for after church, people that are selling the candles, um, most this is very often the case. Most of the people in church are either the clergy, they're all vested, the altar boys that seem to multiply, and I don't really know exactly what they do, but they rush around the church back and forth, doing something. Then it's members of the choir, but people just in the congregation sometimes are practically not there. So it's
Right.
almost like people don't really get it if they don't have something to do. So this issue, I'm going to let you talk in just 1 second. So that's my question. How can we be, without throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Because I really also don't see, how we are a parish if we're not a praying together
Yeah.
community. So I'd like you to think out loud about this
Well,
problem.
I will challenge you by saying that if on the one hand we have an idea of the liturgy as absolutely unchangeable, and it has to be done in a cathedral style, even though we're in a garage. This is the famous emigre situation. Um, well, that becomes an almost impossible task. if we have to replicate the great church, Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, in a tiny little space, what are we really trying to do? And I would say that there are plenty of cases to counter that. I would say, for example, when the Ukrainian church had to go underground after the pseudo Sobor of 1946 in Ukraine, they celebrated in people's houses, they celebrated in barns, they celebrated outdoors, wherever they could celebrate the liturgy without being arrested and hauled off to the concentration camps. This also happened in the catacomb churches. I mean, Father Alexander Men is right over there. He was raised in that. They met in people's houses. Did they do the Byzantine liturgy? Yes, they did. But they couldn't do it with an iconostas, and they couldn't do it with a procession like you would do in a cathedral.
Right. And aside, let me just insert this. The thing about our Typicon is that the parish is not called actually to replicate a cathedral
I
service,
know
we're
that.
called
I
to
know.
replicate a monastic service, a
Yeah,
service where everybody is always there. There's
right.
probably a rather large community, say the Lavra of Saint Sava outside of
Yeah,
Jerusalem. Um, Even an abbess told me not so long ago, uh, that is the convent used to be in the Rocor, and that I used to live there for 5 years, but they left our church. But the abbess of that's been a nun for 40 years, nowadays she's the abbess. She told me that she realized with great difficulty after a while, because she's also a big lover of the Typicon, she said it's unsustainable when we have, about a handful of sisters nowadays,
mhm,
to keep up the whole cycle of services on a daily basis, where you had different brothers or sisters, taking turns and doing this, because it is a ministry. It's a doing, right? It's not just a thinking about it or praying it, spiritually. It's physical work. But she's like, we can't sustain all of the services, but because of the way we're raised, we think, uh, we're not fulfilling the plan. We're falling short. And so in a monastery, it's also a challenge nowadays when life has to be lived. You have to somehow support yourselves also financially, right? So
yeah,
you come up against a system that maybe needs to be, again, without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I like to think how, with love and a traditional, recognition of the essential parts of this. For example, I don't know, I have found ways to, I realize it's not about me. I'm just, as a monastic living in the world, in many ways, uh, I find myself at a certain, a certain difficulty of fulfilling what is considered like a monastic rule, but I enjoy being at this kind of intersection of, you know, the laity, and realizing my life as in sync with the laity's life. But I've tried to share how one can do the hours without actually
yeah,
stopping life. When
right.
Schmemann said he gets the feeling from modern day monasticism that it's not that life is prayer, but that prayer replaces life.
Right,
There's an effort to replace life, to
right,
leave
right.
life, and he didn't get it. And so anyway, I'm I'm trying to get to, how can we stop turning the liturgy into something that actually hinders growth, even hinders catechization, because uh, it makes it almost impossible to explain to people, how is it that we're sharing of the bread? How is it that we're actually participating as one body, when what we see is,
Yeah.
well, for one thing, the
Well, look,
very divorced from us people that are performing, then we're being blocked from seeing the action with iconostasis. Then the singing sometimes is not very enlightening to
well,
the liturgical language. Okay, I am going to stop this tirade, but we seem to be blocking people in some ways, again, I don't want to offend anybody, from Christ through this elaborate thing that we're doing.
Saint Mother Maria Skoptsova didn't actually so much do the theory about this, but she lived it out. And that is to say that she went to the services in the chapel at Rue de l'Omel, at her house of hospitality. She went to the services that she could get to. She was always there on Sunday morning for the Divine Liturgy and on the feast days. But of the other services, she had to go forage for food. Some of the sisters who were living with her for a while were then offended that she wasn't at matins every day. She wasn't at the rest of the hours every day. And her answer to them was, this is not a monastery of that sort. Those of us who are here who are tonsured sisters, nuns, are praying, but we're also working. We're taking care of these people in need who have to be sheltered and fed, right? I mean, at the heart of other houses of hospitality, like those of the Catholic worker, Dorothy Day insisted that every one of them have a chapel and that there be some prayer every day, whether it was morning prayer or vespers, and Mass on Sunday, unless there was a parish church close by. And so it's not an either or. It's not a zero-sum situation at all. But you, I think, have said that. It's not that we just go work and become Marthas, or just pray and be only Marys. That's in fact, Mother Maria did write about that and say that is an unreal dichotomy. One cannot love God without loving the neighbor. One cannot love the neighbor really without loving God. So again, I don't have a recipe for a particular church where the priest or the choir director is intent on replicating either a monastery of the great Lavra in Kiev or the great church in Constantinople. I don't have any answer for that because their answer to me is going to be, we have to spend all of our time on the liturgy. And if there's anything else that's left over, then it's left over. And that's what we're here for. Listen, in my deanery once, I heard a priest say, the only thing we're here for is to do the services. And I mean all of the services, even if nobody's there. That's what we're ordained to do. That's what our vows are about. I don't know that priests take vows, but at any rate, and I listened and I thought to myself, I didn't answer him. Nope, that's not that's a very narrow view of ministry, and that's also a somewhat skewed view of liturgy. All of these other churches that I looked at, I mean, as I said, I looked at a couple of Orthodox ones, but the other ones were across the spectrum, obviously Western churches. They never eliminated the Sunday liturgy. They never eliminated even things like studying the scriptures together. They never eliminated preaching. They never eliminated prayer in everyday life. But I mean, as most parishes, they didn't try to do all of the hours, right? So they had liturgy as part of a life. And I served in a parish, I'm not attached there anymore, for over 26 years, where we tried to follow Father Schmeman's vision of this. And we had a beautiful Sunday liturgy, and we celebrated the feasts with liturgies and vespers, and we did baptisms, always did the baptisms at the Sunday liturgies, and we did, pre-sanctify during service during every week of Lent, Great Lent, and all the services of Holy Week. And yet at the same time, we had other ministries, and we also had people, of course, none of us lived close to the church. All of us commuted in. It was a regional parish. Well, I thought that for who we were and what we could do, we had come to a nice balance of both prayer and work, not unlike, the rule of St. Benedict and the rule of the Master and all the other monastic rules, Basil and the like, and the sayings and lives of the Desert Mothers and Fathers. We prayed, we worked, we had fellowship together, we had, if you will, what constitutes the community of the people of God and the life and the work of the people of God. Among the works of that life, the primary one always was the liturgy, the liturgy of thanksgiving, of prayer, breaking of the bread, and so forth. I'm not pessimistic about this. I think if one wants to be uh, the church, and if one wants to celebrate a resurrection rather than a decline in the death, uh, a community will find a way to do that. However, they have to do it in a way that is possible for them. Like you just said about the former monastery that you had lived in, that the now abbess of it says, we have so few sisters that, to continue to try to do this full version of the Byzantine liturgy is not possible. I would just simply say what I said before. Um, in periods of persecution, in periods of great poverty, in places where there were only a few people, uh, the priest and the rest of the congregation did what they could. And did they think that was liturgy? Yes, they did. Was it the same that would be celebrated under peaceful times in a great cathedral or a great monastery somewhere else? No. I mean, I've been, as you have been, in great cathedrals, east and west, for huge liturgies. And I mean, I've always been amazed. I mean, I walked the length and back of Hagia Sophia a few years ago when we finally got to Turkey. And I was amazed. I said, now I understand where all of this comes from. You got a lot of space here. The gifts were way in the back where they were prepared by the deacons. You got to get them all the way up here. No wonder they sang the cherubic hymn and then other verses, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, then you put a garage or put a little rented space in place of that. I'll give you one sad example. Back during this year and a half of the pandemic, someone I know who is a priest in a mission church, the building that they use for the services is a rented space. It's a former place, a commercial space, and it has no Wi-Fi. None of the buildings there have any Wi-Fi, and they were trying to make the services available because it was at a time when you could not come to church. I mean, they
Right.
Bishop said, obey what the guidance is and what are the restrictions of the state and the county.
Right.
So this priest asked his bishop, can I take the antimens and bring it to my house and do the divine liturgy from my house? Because in theory, all he could do was do the divine liturgy with one altar server and then broadcast it to the people at home. And then can I also do vespers from my home? And the answer was no, you can do no services except in a consecrated space. Well, the rental space wasn't even consecrated. It was a rental space. I mean, I would say the majority of churches that exist in the United States that are of the Eastern Church are not necessarily consecrated spaces. A lot of them are rented spaces. So I said, when I was told this, I said, well, then what about all those parishes that during the summertime on one or more Sundays go out to the park or to the space that they have for picnics and then bring the antimens and have the liturgy out there? Or what about, on big feast days like St. Volodymyr in Kiev, when they do the liturgy out on the esplanade in front of the cathedral there, and you have all the celebrating bishops and priests outdoors, and obviously they brought the antimens out there. And I'm thinking to myself, what's going on here that all of a sudden we can't even pray in a space that is not designated as a church building? I mean, and this is in a time of pandemic. I only bring that up because I think what it suggests is that there is a climate that we're in now in some parts of the Orthodox Church, which is so maximalist and so traditionalist and so narrow that it is beginning to kind of cramp and crunch the liturgy in a way that even the documents of the liturgy, the Typicon including that, could never envision. They would always understand that in some circumstances, things couldn't be done that way. And by the way, what about before the Typicon? What about all the desert dwellers and how they worship? And what about the house churches, and so on?
Well, thank you for responding because that was my question. Is there indeed a certain kind of not healthy straitjacket that is being, not exactly in the spirit
Yeah,
being placed on us? Because on the
yeah,
one hand, we understand that there's hierarchy and
yeah,
obedience, but there is a distortion sometimes, I think, a distortion and maybe even I dare say a strangling of the freedom of the spirit, in to do what's necessary. Because you are
yeah.
you gonna, if you have to if somebody's drowning, you if
You
you
save them.
there, yeah, are you gonna call your bishop? Can I throw him a lifeline? If you're the priest and let's say you're the lifeguard in this analogy, if you need to make a phone call when you need to make just a responsible decision, because one would think that you're entrusted with the anti-mension instead of a table, because
Right.
you have been ordained to carry responsibility in a
Correct.
place where there isn't the bishop, that he has entrusted you to make decisions. You're
Yes.
not infantilized like, from the uh, side of priests. Sometimes might be exhaustion with the reluctance of laity to take
Yeah.
responsibility to do
Well,
something. I think a lot of bishops, I know it's from both sides that this
sure.
infantilization
Sure.
happens, but sometimes I think bishops would be more than happy for you to take the
Yes.
responsibility, do it please, and don't ask the bishop what he can't really understand from where he's sitting, because maybe he doesn't know there's no Wi-Fi. He doesn't understand that this is two steps away
Exactly.
from this garage. But you're wanting him to take the responsibility. I don't know. I think more responsibility, more responsible decision making uh, on the part of those people who are not wearing those vestments, because
Yeah.
the clericalization and what I would call episcopization of the church, where the
Mhm.
church is considered only to be there where those people wearing the funny hats are standing. But uh, that's why people sort of sit back and are inactive, in this
Yeah.
creative process that is being church in our time.
Well, I would go one step further, and I would say that if you wanted a recipe for decline and death, it would begin to sound like we have never done it that way before. I think they were called years ago the seven last words of the church. Uh, I and I know that will produce a reaction on the part of some people, but he's now gone. Our former bishop, Archbishop Peter Lhuillier, who was a canon lawyer, a degree from the Moscow Theological Academy, used to say, by way of reprimand to priests who said, "I have to ask you, Vladika, about everything." He would say, and I'm not going to do his accent here, but he would say, "You are the pastor of the place. If you call me, I'm going to ask you, tell me about the people. And I'm going to say to you, most likely, you are the one who knows best what to do here. And if there's any problem, then come back to me." But in other words,
Right.
the sort of operating understanding, let's call it trust, uh, uh, in a diocese between the bishop and the clergy should be that I trust you, being the bishop, be the pastor of the place and to do what is appropriate and to even use some economy, use some understanding, use some flexibility if need be. And he was the kind of man who, when presented with conflict filled demands, would simply say, for example, when at the cathedral people said, we want the liturgy back in Slavonic, it will attract more converts. Uh, he simply said, no, we are not going to do that. It is not the language of our country. But if I were back in France, I would be doing the liturgy in French. I would not be doing the liturgy in Slavonic. And I mean, he was a person who respected the tradition. Father Meyendorff. I didn't know Father Schmemann, but I did know Father John Meyendorff. If you go through his writings, if you listen to any of the tapes of his talks, again, somebody who was an expert on the Byzantine world and its Christology and liturgy and canon law and so forth. But if you read the things that he used to write for the OCA newspaper and that were gathered together in several volumes, extremely good pastor in being sensible and taking into consideration, on the one hand, the needs of the time and the actual children of God in a particular place, and what the tradition was about and what the tradition said. And he did things in his time, along with Father Schmemann, pastorally, that today you might be hauled before the bishop. But in their minds, this was good pastoral practice. So I'm not saying disobey the rules and make light of the structures that we have. I'll come back to what the whole point of this study was, and that is we have at the heart of our tradition the church as the people of God, as a community, not just the bishops, not just the priests, and not just the laity, but the whole. Because when you say people of God, you mean all of them. And if the church has a future, which of course it has, it is through the Spirit and through resurrection. And there are paths that are right there in most locales for pursuing. If you want to be church in that place, these are the paths that you could go down. If you want to kind of close up shop and act as though nothing is going to bother you, nothing is going to change, you can close in on yourself and do that too. That's a tragic choice. It's not. It's not. It doesn't have anything of life or resurrection in it.
So when there's a crisis situation or a crossroads, there is a decision to be made, is what I'm understanding. That
Yeah,
sometimes it might mean turning in on yourself, or digging in your heels. Maybe that could also be being in the trenches and digging in your heels. Maybe that could be a strategy for some places or people. But I think it's like the Christ and civilization
yeah,
dichotomy, and the ways in which people, according to their different vocations, have
yeah,
decided that to resolve either that tension or to bring those together.
yeah.
So there are
Because
different solutions.
Niebuhr really intended by that the idea of Christ and culture, that you always have the transforming power and love of Christ. So, I mean, if we keep that at the center and not think that somehow you have to leave Christ out of this because it's all about the canons and about the bishops and about the rules and about the church. Well, if you say leave Christ out of it, and supposedly it's about the church, you have lost the connection, because there is no church without Christ.
And there's no Christ without love, right?
Right.
I mean, love for one another, and not
Yeah.
devouring everybody who's not doing exactly what you're doing,
Yeah.
because people have different visions, because they have different
Exactly.
vocations. Everybody
Yeah.
has their strength, their weakness. Some people just, they're the kind of liturgical dork that can can
Yeah.
do this according,
Yeah.
and they like it, and other people like it. I don't know, it's different vocations. So I think that there's sometimes a tendency to uh, standardize to the extent where it's a cookie cutter kind of approach to parishes, that
Hmm.
maybe uh, I don't know, I'm not even talking about a concrete example that I know, but I think that, sometimes in situations of crisis or unusual situations, as we have seen in the pandemic, there is, we need some space to breathe and to
Yeah,
be creative a little bit. But with,
it's
again,
always
yeah.
it's always better if you bring the church together. I mean, if you listen to, for example, the Western Church these days, uh, one of the great things about the Reformation is that it restored the conciliar principle of the church, that it isn't just the bishops who decide and act. I mean, they decide and act, but always, as St. Cyprian said, with consultation of the clergy and the laity. So the Reformation really did build into the reforming and renewal of the church, um, consulting and meeting together as church, as community, as in a conciliar way. Now in the Roman Catholic world, you're hearing about this as synodality. It's just a different word, but it means exactly the same thing. Um, in the East, well, the OCA used to be one of those churches that had followed through the years the things that were said and done at the Moscow Council of 1917 and 1918, which was a truly conciliar event, cut short by the revolution. But you had there representatives of the laity, of the monastic houses, the clergy, and the bishops. Right, the bishops had the final say always, yes, but they talked about things together. They acted as church together. Well, most Orthodox church bodies in the world now have forgotten that. Um, Even the Russian church, where the Moscow Council happened, when they have councils now, they're for very specific purposes, right? You know this, or they're just the bishops. Um, I would say I would say that if you take each parish, Afanasiev says this, each parish is the church in its fullness. It is not the whole church, but it is not just a branch. It is not just a 7-Eleven or a Wendy's or some other local branch of a chain. Every local parish is a church in its own right, but part of the whole. Then the model works at every level. It works at the level of the national or the local church of a country. It works at the level of the diocese, and it clearly does work at the level of the local congregation or a parish. That when you are trying to be the church, you try to do that together, but not just in words, but also in deeds. And I used to be part of a parish in which I wasn't part of it, but where the rector, the pastor, and the council always aimed at consensus. Obviously, he was the rector, but not the tyrant and not, the one who decides everything. Well, nowadays the tendency is in the other direction, that the diocesan assembly, the diocesan council, the parish council is but a consultative body. And so that whoever is in power can make a decision and in principle not even inform the rest of them. This is not a good way to be church, whether we're talking about Orthodox churches, Catholic churches, or Reformation churches. This is, as Afanasiev says, where we have replaced the power of love with the power of law or the power of a few. And it's interesting that in the history of the church, this is something that has always been a matter of tension and has always caused some of the worst problems in the history of the people of God.
Well, I like that you share with us. Thank you so much. And so generously and honestly, some of our challenges, but also not without shedding a lot of light and hope on the situation, and reminding us that we are pointed to resurrection, and we're called to also think about various forms and various ways in which we can be led from death, from the empty tomb to resurrection. Sorry if that was an oversimplified
No,
summary.
that's a good
Would you,
way of
um,
concluding.
would you have any final thoughts to share with our viewers before we go?
Well, I'll tell you what, at the very end of the book, I thought there were a couple of lines that do get at this, and I thought I would just end by quoting myself.
Okay, great.
As we have argued, it is clearly not just the death of congregations that we can expect, but their resurrection, a living out of Christ's own action in the heart of the faith. And the community of the people of God will be a sacrament, just as the sacraments of the table and the font that gather them. Church will endure because community will persist. God, as Eugene Peterson says in his biblical translation, will continue to move into the neighborhood. As some Eucharistic prayers proclaim it, Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again.
Amen. Thank you, Father Michael. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'll remind you from my end that even though we didn't talk about the online community building that we also have going on all over the internet and various Christian communities, we do have a weekday podcast. If you want to join us for morning coffee, you can sign up on patreon.com/Sister Vasa. I'm providing the link here. You can sign on for as little as $1 for a whole month, and you gain access to our 5-day-a-week podcast. So join us if you are interested in between Sundays, in between weekends, in some kind of accompaniment. We are very engaged. We have over 500 people who engage in a lively manner, and we on a weekday basis discuss the lives of the saints, both new calendar and older calendar, my friends, usually a scripture passage or a liturgical verse of some sort that we can chew over as we begin our day. And the podcast isn't long, 20, 25 minutes long usually. So tune in if you're interested in that. And we're going to thank, with a warm round of applause from all over the world, our wonderful guest today and my dear friend, Father Michael Plekon. Everybody, let's thank Father Michael and have a wonderful week. And I will chat with you, good people, next time. Bye, everyone.